Alright, in this video, I want to talk about the first round of Romania's presidential election, which occurred yesterday on the 4th of May. The second round will occur in 2 weeks' time on the 18th of May, which will decide the winner and the future president of Romania. Now, in first place came nationalist candidate George Simeon from the Alliance of the Unity of Romanians, with around 41% of the vote, a clear winner in first place, meaning he will qualify for the second round. And in second place came Nicu Sordan, the former mayor of Bucharest, who kind of ran as an independent centrist backed by some of the liberal parties with huge urban support in, of course, the Bucharest, where he was a former mayor. And he came second place narrowly with 21% of the vote, ahead of Crin Antonescu, which was another candidate of the center, backed by the center-left and center-right establishment parties, who won only around 20%. So this is, of course, the candidates that are going to be in the runoff. It will be George Simeon and Nicu Sordan. So we have a nationalist, kind of right-wing populist candidate, and then a candidate of some of the centrist parties that is going to have support from the more liberal establishment, definitely do better in some of the urban areas. And if we take a look at the map, we can see that George Simeon did very well in some of the rural areas, did very well across the entire country, but did particularly well in some of the parts of the east on the border with Moldova and Ukraine. Foreign policy issues has been a major focus of George Simeon, and a lot of voters there probably, the proximity to Ukraine has been an issue for some of them. Some of the bigger cities, such as Bucharest itself, went for Dan, who was the former mayor there. And then if we take a look at the diaspora areas where there's a lot of the Hungarian minorities, they heavily backed Crin Antonescu, who was, I believe, backed by the Hungarian Minority Party. Now, this is going to be a very interesting election because it is still up for debate who is going to win this election. George Simeon is far ahead, almost twice the amount of support that Nicu Sordan has, but in the runoff, it could be somewhat interesting. Now, first, I want to look at the first round of the original presidential election. Now, originally, the presidential elections were held in November of 2024, and Călin Georgescu, who was a kind of independent right-wing candidate, came out of nowhere and won first place with 23% of the vote. Later on, the Constitutional Court in Romania ruled that this election had to be annulled, and they canceled the runoff. And the reason they did this was they suspected that Călin Georgescu his campaign had been meddled by the Russians, and him being a pro-Russian candidate, they considered this to be a national security threat, and so there was a huge debate in Romania. The elections were canceled, and both Călin Georgescu and Elena Lasconi, which were, a nationalist candidate and then a more liberal candidate, criticized the constitutional courts, along with George Simeon from the actual Alliance for Unity of Romania parties. And there were a lot of protests. There was a lot of backlash at this election, but eventually the constitutional courts decided to rehold the election in springtime, and of course now. And eventually Călin Georgescu was barred from running again in this new election, and for that reason, George Simeon became the kind of candidate of the right-wing populist camp, and Călin Georgescu ended up supporting George Simeon once he decided to run in his place. There's been some differences between the two, but they've kind of come together for this election. Elena Lasconi, which won second place, which qualified for the runoff originally, decided to run, but her party actually backed Nicu Sordan, and so she is running now from her party, but kind of more as an independent, and she believe I believe she only got a few percentage points and came around fifth. So neither of the candidates that qualified for the second round of the original election are going to be involved, and a lot of the candidates, for example, Marcel Ciolacu, none of these candidates are really running in this election, for the exception of George Simeon, which has won a first-place victory. Now, I want to take a look at the results themselves for all the candidates. As we can see, George Simeon won 41% of the vote, clearly ahead, and Nicu Sordan was second with 21%. Now, it's very interesting. The polls had Crin Antonescu slightly ahead of Nicu Sordan for the second-place finish, and this is going to be somewhat important because the polls do show a slight difference in both of these candidates going against George Simeon. I believe Nicu Sordan is slightly weaker against Simeon, whereas Antonescu was a bit stronger, but of course the polls have both candidates winning in either scenario. You also had Victor Ponta, who was a former prime minister from the Social Democrats, who ran in this election, but only got 13%. And then we have Elena Lasconi, who ran without the support of her party, down at 2.68% of the vote. Now, I want to look lastly at the polls for this election. Now, as I said earlier, or previously in the video when I did about the original presidential election, the polls were way off. Călin Georgescu was only polling around 4 or 5% and ended up getting 22%. The polls were very off. And even this time, George Simeon was polling around 30, at most 35%, and ended up getting 40. And the polls for the second place finisher were off. So the polls, I don't think, are too reliable, and I don't want to take too much of a focus on this. I think we're just going to have to wait for the results in 2 weeks' time to see who actually wins. But at least according to polls between Simeon and Dan, it is kind of a up in the air who is going to win this. I believe Dan is slightly favored because a lot of the voters from Crin and Antonescu will probably go to him. Simeon's vote is very large because the nationalist camp is kind of consolidated around him. Some of the other nationalist parties have not ran candidates and have decided to back Simeon, including Călin Georgescu and the people from the Party of the Young, and SOS Romania, I believe, has not endorsed him, but a lot of their voters have probably ended up going for Simeon. And so for this reason, in the second round, we will see a large swing of voters to Dan, giving him, making up the margin that he has. But Simeon is already 20 points ahead, so we'll have to see how this election turns out. I would say, I'm not going to make any predictions. I don't know who is really the clear favorite. Simeon is slightly behind in the polls, but he did outperform the first round polling, and so this point I say either one has a fair shot of winning this election. It will be very important because Romania is not a huge state, but it is going to be a very something very significant for the EU. This is definitely a proxy battle between the pro-EU camp under Dan and then the more anti-establishment, more anti-EU camp aligned with people like Viktor Orban, Giorgia Meloni, the nationalist side in Europe with Simeon. So if they have one member of the European Council, head of state of an EU country, shift hands from the EU side to the anti-EU side, that will change the balance of power in Europe. And of course, this will have repercussions for Romania itself. The coalition government has, I believe, kind of collapsed, and we will likely have a new, basically complete change in the political make of Romania after this election. If we have George Simeon, who's kind of an outsider, who's just entered into Romanian politics with his party a few years ago, becomes the president, that would definitely shake things up, and we will have to see how this affects Romanian politics in the future. But of course, I will do another video probably as we get closer, or at least definitely when we get the results in 2 weeks' time for the election. So that's going to be it for covering Romania. And last thing I want to look at quickly is the polls for the Polish presidential election. Now, this will happen also in a few weeks for the first round, and I believe the second round will be in June, so it's a bit later, but nonetheless, I wanted to cover some of the polls. Now, some things have changed in this election. Early on, we had a kind of a challenge on the right of the Law and Justice Party's candidate Naroki by Mensen from the Confederation Party. He had surged around 20%. It is now clear that Mensen has lost a lot of that momentum. He's still doing very well. He's still doing a lot better than his party has done in previous elections at around 13% of the vote, which is a very strong showing for him. However, he's no longer at the 20% mark, and I think it's very clear that this election will be, as the previous several elections has been, between the candidates of the Civic Platform and the candidate of the Law and Justice Party. Now, the Law and Justice Party won 2 terms, with Andrzej Duda being their president, and so for them to win a third term is going to be very difficult. They are behind in the polls in the first round, and in the second round, polls do show the former Warsaw mayor, Rafał Trzaskowski, beating Naroki in the second round. So it is very likely at this point that there will be a kind of a second round between the Law and Justice and the Civic Platform candidate, and the Civic Platform will most likely take the presidency. And this will be very important for them because until now you've had a Civic Platform government, a coalition government of the Civic Platform and some of the other parties on the center left and the center. However, with the presidency under the control of the Law and Justice Party, there has been there's been an imbalance or not imbalance. There has been a divide in the power in Poland, and so there's been times where the prime minister and the president are at odds, and that has definitely hindered the ability for the Civic Platform to make laws and to do everything they want to. So this would be a big victory for the kind of pro-EU camp, but we could see kind of a shift if George Simeon wins in Romania and Trzaskowski wins in Poland. We could see kind of a shift in the power. We could see Romania move further out of the EU camp and more to the anti-establishment, Eurosceptic camp, and then we could see Poland move even closer back into the fold of Brussels, into the EU, and so we could see some major shifts going on within the European Union. So that's going to be it for this video, and I just want to cover these elections. But if you do like the videos, please do like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one. Thank you all for watching.